So I'm here with Mwiya Musokotwane of Thebe Investment Management and its affiliate Frontier Capital Partners. Hey Mwiya,
Hey,
thank you so much for joining us today and for being open to talking with us about what you're building in Zambia and really where you're hoping to go with it.
I know you get to talk about Nkwashi a lot, right? And there is this fantastic interview that you gave about your background and the connection between the new city that you're building and a lot of the economics theory and the political theory and the history around that. And I think we'll make sure that we kind of like link to that interview at the bottom of this one. But I don't think it's quite as often that you get to talk about the difference that technology can make, right? When you are planning and building a new city, and how that might really enable growth in new development and all the other cities that Frontier Capital Partners will kind of be developing across the continent. So I thought maybe we could just start by having you share with all of our kind of watchers and listeners here. What is it that you're building, and why does Africa really need new cities right now?
cool. So we're building a city in Zambia. It's a satellite town. It's about a half-hour drive east of Zambia's capital, and it's going to be anchored by education services. And so the reason we're building this is that Zambia's population is really growing rapidly. At independence from Britain in 1964, we had a population of sub 3 million people. And is now in excess of about 18 million people. Lusaka, the capital, had about 1 million people living in it 19 years ago, and has in excess of 3 million people living in it now. And so, there's been a lot of rapid growth in the past, and there's going to be more rapid growth in the future. Because again, over the next 5 years, 10 years, by 2030, Lusaka is scheduled to grow to forecasted to grow to about 5 million people, and then 10 million people by 2050, in excess of 20 million people by 2100. And it's not very obvious where all these people will live, because populations, as they emerge, aren't really being planned for. The infrastructure that makes these cities livable isn't being developed. And that's largely because, populations are growing way faster than the government at the national and at the municipal level has capacity to service. So as it stands, the country already has significant infrastructure deficits. And so that makes it structurally difficult for it to deal with these forward-looking issues. So that we've just taken a view that this is going to be something that's sorely needed, not just here in Zambia, but across the whole continent. And to be fair to the government, they do have a plan in place. The thing is, population growth is just way faster than they have capacity to manage, because over the last 5 years, their existing government has spent billions of dollars trying to address these legacy issues. But even with all of that, it's only scratching the surface at what the need actually is.
Yeah.
And so we sort of see this as an international problem. It's expressing itself here locally, but really it's a legacy problem that is prevalent throughout all of Africa.
So what is it that you're building in Nkwashi, and how does that relate to what Frontier Capital Partners intends to continue to drive across the continent?
So what we're building is infrastructure. So the things that make housing possible. So we're looking at everything that's below the foundation of a house, so to speak. So the roads, the utility services, green spaces, parks, social infrastructure like schools and a university, all those key parts that make it possible for people to live in a city, in a very sustainable manner, and then enabling others to build their own homes.
Got it. And how does that connect to what you envision to continue to create across the rest of the continent?
Well, it's more or less the same thing in the
Yeah.
sense that, across the whole continent, infrastructure is needed and is in short supply. And so we intend to provide the infrastructure. So we see ourselves as a sort of OEM, right? So building these cities and vending them. And we see education as a big part of making the cities long-term viable, in the sense that, as it stands, local economies are largely geared towards extractive industries. So things like mining, forestry, farming, that sort of thing. And we don't necessarily see those as large employers of people long-term. We think that automation is going to take a lot of those jobs. And in any case, they aren't really high-paying jobs, right? And so to the extent that it's necessary for us to make these cities centers of wealth creation for their residents, we need to figure out ways of creating high-value jobs for people. And we don't think building factories is the way to do that either. We think building remote working hubs that service the rest of the world is the way to do so. So step one in that process is building a university that fast tracks people's education. So instead of taking 4 years to do an undergraduate study of, say, computer science, a person will take 2 years. And then immediately they complete their studies. The university would take support to the extent that person has grades, the individual into this remote working job, servicing a global business. And so that could be a tech startup that's looking to scale, based in San Francisco. And so instead of paying, let's say, $90,000, $150,000 to a junior developer starting out their career in San Francisco, they could pay, say, $20,000 to a junior developer starting their career in Zambia. And eventually, to someone sitting in San Francisco, they probably couldn't pay rent on a one-bedroom apartment for that. But in Zambia, that would be considered a very well-paying job. And it would be almost 15 times over existing GDP per capita. So that would be a really transformative thing to do. And that's what we think will make the cities long-term viable, in the sense that, to the extent that the majority of people are working jobs of that sort, where they're earning in excess of $15,000 per year, that purchasing power is coming back to the cities. They'll be spending in the cities, which creates several positive externalities. They, consume goods and services locally, which creates jobs for other people. It creates linkages to the local supply chains, which creates new opportunities for people to do other things, right? It's opportunities for people involved in various forms of trade.
Yeah. I think I lost you there for just a little bit. And why don't I just give you a quick sec to finish up the point that you were making, and that was, here's what happens when people have that kind of economic growth that comes with this education potential and access to employment opportunities remotely.
So global businesses, but be domiciled in cities here in Africa, to the extent that there's a large concentration of such people. It creates significant flows of liquidity from the rest of the world into the cities, which creates purchasing power. And that purchasing power then has several positive externalities, in that it creates demand for local goods and services, because whilst the individuals may earn their money working for businesses which aren't domiciled in Zambia, for example, they themselves are domiciled here, the individual that is. And so everything they need, from clothing to food to a place to live in, is consumed locally. And that creates opportunities for other people downstream or even upstream.
What I love about what you're sharing, Mwiya, is that it is both an economic vision as well as a social one for the new city that you're creating in Nkwashi, as well as the other ones that you might be building the infrastructure to support across the continent. So let me ask you this. when you're creating a new city, it's somewhat like a blank slate, right? From the community services to the community's values to the community experiences that might be there. And you're like, for what you're doing in Nkwashi, you are planning your city, right? So what are some of the things that you think will be most meaningful for the people of that community that you can do differently because it is new, right? Because it's a new city?
I think the most important thing is the flexibility that comes with starting from scratch, and that one has to consider, especially if you're using your own capital, which is the case with us, you have to consider the best and highest use of literally every single square inch dollar you have available needs to be put to good use. And so I think that's something that if you are a legacy city, isn't typically the case, largely because you can always just raise new taxes, or you could request a bailout from the central government, as often happens here in Africa. And so I think this need to make whatever only viable but sustainable requires a lot of practicality, and I think that's probably the single most important thing that starting from scratch has made possible for us.
What does it do, right? Like, what does that do for the community experiences or the community values that end up kind of becoming birthed from starting from that sense of flexibility and practicality?
I think it's too early for us to say, just largely because we're only at the stage where our first couple of people are starting to build now. Mm-hmm. So it remains to be seen.
Okay, so as we think of Nkwashi, and the types of experiences and lives that you really hope for the people that come to live in this new community that you're creating, right? How can technology make a difference? What is the role of technology in the city that you're creating?
I think several. So at the micro level, at the macro level as well. So at the macro level, that idea I just spoke to regarding how we think education could be transformative requires the use of technology. Right. So we are working on tools internally to make that happen. In any story a person tells about their travels, oftentimes it's a collection of their experiences there, right? So the places they chose to go and eat, how difficult or easy it was to get around the city, what the public transport was like, all those things ultimately make or break the experience. And one of the things we've been thinking about is how you can optimize the experience of living in a city or visiting a city by simply making it significantly more convenient to be there, right? And so if you live in any city for a long enough time, eventually you have to pay property taxes there, right? Or you have to look for a place to live there. And it can be a pain to do so. And so one of the things I want to do is make it possible for a person to really easily pay for their property taxes in the city they live in, to look for a place to live, and have a single database where every single is made available, or rather searchable. And so the marketplace is made, so to speak, right? And all information asymmetry that typically exists in the cities is basically done away with. If you're looking for a place to eat, again, all the information is made available to you. And all of this information is oftentimes, it goes beyond just the ratings that other residents or visitors of a particular business or rating system, whether it's an A-grade, sanitation standard establishment, right?
Right.
What are the total number of visitors there? versus space relative to the occupancy. That's completely from the marketplace. And in businesses often have that same. So if I'm a purveyor of, let's say, leather goods, it's not possible for me to know what the average price is across the entire city, adjusting for quality standards, national statistics. So granular levels was made available. Registering a business could be significantly easier. Oftentimes in Africa, it takes a couple of days and it tends to be expensive. We think we could streamline that process using technology and use the volumes of technology to hopefully press registries to reduce their costs. CRM for cities, I think, is pretty important. Supposing a street light isn't working on my street, and I were to complain about it.
Yeah.
Right? I would like to have a follow-up process where I know who the person dealing with the issue is, and as the complaint gets passed through the chain of custody, it's clear by whom the matter is now being dealt with. And when it's brought to a close, again, that tracking log is available for me to see, and I can confirm. Stuff like that oftentimes is really inconvenient to do in cities.
Yeah. And yet, as you say, right, like if you're creating a city and community services from scratch, and it is and should be possible to envision ways that could be more convenient, more efficient, and better enabled by making the right types of practical choices for where to put technology from the get-go. I love it. That feels really right. I also really love the way that you talk about what it's like for a city to be able to learn, right? To learn from its residents when this, for instance, the story you shared on if a city light wasn't working and they need to, and someone wants the city to know about it. How important is it to you, or in what ways is it important when you're creating a new development like Nkwashi to be able to ask residents what they need and be able to listen to what they want?
It's pretty important. Ultimately, a city is a product and a service. But again, products that are developed by committee or consensus tend to suck as well. And so part of the product development, process is being able to predict with some level of certainty what people want, but then validating that or not really rapidly. So to the extent that one's assumptions are found to be wrong, changing those assumptions fairly quickly so that you can arrive at the thing that actually A, matches your own vision, but more importantly, B, has actual market fit. And I think the idea of having this sort of CRM service for the city is a powerful way of doing it because it gives you real-time access to people who live in your city. So, if the standards in the city are declining, right, you will know fairly quickly that they're declining. People will tell you. If people don't like the pricing of a particular service, I get it to be fairly almost instantaneous feedback that you'll be receiving.
Mwiya, this has been fantastic. I so appreciate you kind of inviting us into your world and into the story of Nkwashi, right? Inviting us into the future that you're envisioning, and really what you're beginning to build in Zambia. So I'm very excited for where you're going. I know we've talked about this in the past, and just excited to be working with you on it. So before we wrap, anything else that you wanted to make sure that we share?
No, I think that's basically it. I'm excited to see how this new collaboration goes.
Yeah, thanks so much, man, for the time today. I know our connection across several continents and oceans didn't always work perfectly for us. So thanks for kind of like rolling with the punches on the interview. As I said, what we end up with is beautiful and perfect in the way that it ends. So it's just important for us to keep this conversation going.
Awesome. I agree.
Cool.